Good afternoon. My name is Alan Price. I'm director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. On behalf of the Kennedy Library and the Edward M. Kennedy Institute, I am delighted to welcome everyone who is watching to this afternoon's program online. Thank you for joining us today. I would like to thank the National Commission of Military, National, and Public Service for joining us today in a conversation about the importance of service in our communities. The Commission's work and report coincide with the time in our nation that has raised people's awareness of the importance of public service. As the nation continues to address both a global pandemic and domestic questions of equity and justice, a new generation has awakened to the importance of public service in all forms, from local community building to federally elected leadership. The Commission defines service as a personal commitment of time, energy, and talent to a mission that contributes to the public good by protecting the nation and its citizens, strengthening communities, or promoting the general welfare. The Commission envisions that by 2031, the 70th anniversary of President Kennedy's call for Americans to serve their nation, that 5 million Americans will begin participating in military, national, or public service each year. The Commission's work has personal resonance for me. I have dedicated much of my life to military, national, and public service, and found the work to be meaningful and gratifying. I served as a second lieutenant in the infantry in the U.S. Army National Guard. I served on a local review board that investigated civilian complaints about a police department. I served as a local school board member. Like many of you, I consider my neighborhood work and my church work to be forms of public service. I would later serve in the Obama administration as the Associate Director of Management for the Peace Corps, an extraordinary agency that continues the vision that President Kennedy established. Now I serve as Director of a presidential library within the National Archives and Records Administration. In each of these roles, I learned firsthand the importance of service and the opportunity each of us has to improve the lives of the people around us. President Kennedy believed in public service and inspired millions of Americans with his inaugural call to service with the words, "And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." That belief in public service that President Kennedy so often spoke about was also embodied so powerfully in the life, legacy, ideals, and moving words of his brothers and sisters, which is why it is so fitting that we should co-host this conversation with the Edward M. Kennedy Institute. Our institutions share a mission of engaging, educating, and inspiring citizens so that future generations will answer the call to civil and public service, and with that energy, strengthen our democracy. As Senator Kennedy said, we have never lost our belief that we are all called to a better country and a newer world. Now I am pleased to introduce Vice Chair of the National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service, Marc Guerin. Marc Guerin's career has included leadership roles in public service and higher education. Mr. Garin is currently the director of the Institute of Politics at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Previously, he served as president of Hobart and William Smith Colleges for 18 years. In government, he has served as the director of the Peace Corps, White House Director of Communications, and Deputy Chief of Staff. Mr. Garin has been engaged in national and international service organizations, including as chair of the Corporation for National and Community Service and board member for Points of Light, Jesuit Volunteer Corps, and the Leadership Council for the Franklin Project. In higher education, he has served as chair of the Annapolis Group, chair of Campus Compact, and chair of the Talloires Network, as well as board member of the National Association of Independent Colleges and the New York State Council of Independent Colleges. Please join me in welcoming Vice Chair Marc Guerin.
Well, thank you very much, Alan, for that warm and generous introduction and welcome. I thank you for your public service, which has certainly crossed the arc the mandate of our commission. So I thank you very much for that warm welcome. And for those of us here in Boston, we thank you for your leadership of the library. It's a treasured part of Boston and Massachusetts generally, and your leadership is in collaboration with us on so many fronts is appreciated and valued. We offer a warm welcome to our panelists who you will hear from, and to all of you listening. We thank you for taking the time at this very important time in our nation's civic life to think about some of the issues that have animated our work on the National Commission for Military National and Public Service over the past 3 years. We had certainly hoped that in the spring this could have been an event in person at Columbia Point, at the beautiful library and the EMK Institute. But I am very glad and grateful that through the power of technology, we are able to perhaps engage even more people from across the nation who will hear about our work, will be, I hope, motivated by our work and think through ways they can make a difference in this way. So at the beginning, on behalf of the commission, I formally thank the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum and the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate for partnering with us on this important occasion, for privileging these issues that certainly, as Alan said beautifully, speak to both President Kennedy and Senator Kennedy's leadership. I also want to begin by expressing on behalf of the commission our deep gratitude for the nation's public servants, for our medical professionals, those involved in military service and national service members, and volunteers that are working tirelessly across the nation to stem the spread of the coronavirus. It is that American spirit of service and how we can hopefully unleash that power and its potential to some of our common challenges that is the focus certainly of the work of the commission, but in our discussion today. So that same spirit that both President Kennedy and Senator Kennedy spoke of, both were important champions of service through their words, through their deeds, helping to build what is today the national service movement and infrastructure that through the recommendations on our report, we hope to enhance and expand on the great foundation that they have laid before us. President Kennedy's own journey and professional life speaks to his commitment to service, serving in the Navy as a public servant. And as Alan and I both know, through our own service, creating the United States Peace Corps, an innovation at the time that has spoke to Americans' commitment to service and making a difference in what it has done both domestically here in the United States by the experience of Peace Corps volunteers and its good work around the world. As a former director of the Peace Corps and my work on the board of the Corporation for National and Community Service, I have personally seen the impact of President Kennedy's legacy in the good work of both Peace Corps volunteers and AmeriCorps and other streams of service out in the field doing very important work. And it is that inspiration that I think we all take as we think about enhancing and building national service in our nation. Senator Kennedy as well, serving in the United States Army and of course in the United States Senate, was the lead author of both the 1993 law that created AmeriCorps and the Corporation for National and Community Service, and the 2009 law that bared his name, that strengthened and enhanced the national service programs. So in each case, we have a legacy of their own initiative, a legislative record, and administrative achievements that the Kennedy brothers formed, for which we're very, very grateful, inspired to be partnering with the library and the Institute in this way. Over the past 2.5 years, my colleagues on the commission, the National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service, often discussed the impact of President Kennedy and Senator Kennedy's legacy on their views of service, on their inspiration for public service, and what it could mean as we move forward. Our final report, which was issued in March, laid out what we believe is a bold vision for how our country can think about and implement an expansion of the ethos of service in our country. It was inspired in many ways by President Kennedy and Senator Kennedy, for a nation to have the kind of common experience of service, and where it is the norm, not the exception, where every American could indeed be inspired and eager to serve. That was how we thought about our work. We had issued in our report this, again, bold agenda, in my judgment. It has 164 recommendations in integrating into our approach that builds on the traditions of service that exist in our country. And so that in its totality, when you get through all those recommendations, our plan would lead, we believe, to the day when one is not surprised at all by the question, how have you served? Or how will you serve? It will become the norm, not the exception. Let me just take a moment to describe the work of the commission and how we got here. Congress created this bipartisan 11-member commission back in 2017 and tasked us with this comprehensive and holistic view, reviewing the selective service in all forms of service. For the first time ever in our nation's history, military, national, and public service was joined in this way under the mandate for our commission. We traveled around the country and we found, much like de Tocqueville did 200 years ago, from the earliest days of our nation, that America's spirit of service, America's commitment and generosity to one another continues to shape this nation. We saw that across the nation. Americans repeatedly stepping up to support one another, to offer their own sweat and their ingenuity, and where needed, without exception, not expecting anything in return. It has been inspirational to see the good work going on around our country. Yet, it is also the case that in a nation of 329 million people, we also have not unlocked really the full potential and the transformational power and the potential of service in our nation to address some of the critical needs and problems that exist, and through that service to really enhance and cultivate and engage the civic fabric of our American society. So as Alan said, our recommendations are that by 2031, which would be the 70th anniversary of President Kennedy's call to service in our nation, we would envision that 5 million Americans will begin to serve in military, national, or public service each year. This includes more than enough qualified individuals serving and capable of serving and prepared for serving, meeting the minimum needs for the traditional military recruiting. It would include 1 million individuals taking up federally supported national service opportunities through an expanded AmeriCorps to the levels imagined in the Edward M. Kennedy Serve America Act, and creating new models as well. And it would modernize our government's personnel system, attracting and enabling the next generation of Americans who have critical skills to enter public service, who see that as a powerful way to make a difference and see the potential by lowering the barriers that exist and by modernizing the systems to recruit and attract the talented generation that's before us. So service, in our judgment, and the work of the commission, would begin at an early age and would continue throughout one's lifetime, the whole arc of one's lifetime animated by this, by developing skills and leadership among those who participate. It would maximize the federal investment that currently exists in pursuit of local and state and national problems and solutions to those problems. It would help develop our nation's workforce in important ways. And through all of this work, it would bring together many, many people across the nation to meet these developing needs. And what I see people yearning for is to unite Americans across the divisions that exist in our country. Service offers us that possibility. We've seen it across the country. We've seen the power of it in solving real problems, real needs in communities across the nation. And we've seen the power of people working together through the inspiration of service, crossing the divides that exist for the betterment of our society. So really cultivating this culture of service, this ethos of service that we talked about over the 2.5 years of our commission, requires this immediate action. It does require continued attention on the part of policymakers at the state, federal, and local level. And it requires a frank discussion among those of us who care about these issues of how do we increase the awareness of, how do we increase the aspiration for access to service. I think we can do that. And so in our report, we've challenged the nation to cultivate this culture of service. It's possible for every American who wants to serve to answer President Kennedy's call to service, as Alan started us out with. Again, to set that goal, that ambitious goal, and through our recommendations to meet it by 2031. So all of these actions and recommendations that we've contained in our report would put America on a path to realize this goal, which I believe if it were achieved, and I'm hopeful that it would be transformative. As the nation's efforts to put a man on the moon were bold and ambitious, so too for the work of our commission and for us collectively as a country to place national service on that par, that aspirational par, to make a difference. So we are fortunate to have these conversations with an outstanding panel today who will address the question of how do we enhance that culture of service and strengthen our communities across the country. And I think it's even more powerful and more critical today that we have these conversations, given what's happening in our society. This is not a time in American civic life for us to be quiet or not responding to the challenges that we see and the cries and the urgency that we see around our nation. Service can be a part of the solution, we believe, and we are proud to present our recommendations and engage in conversations that we have. What we learned and what I learned from the work of this commission, traveling the nation, is that Americans across the country are asking that question. How can they make a difference? How can they meaningfully give back to their community and to their nation? How can they engage in service and in life to build the kind of resilience in their community? And how do we create that more just, more equitable, more inclusive society that is the work and the mission of this commission? So it is my great honor to represent the commission here. But I'm most anxious really to turn the conversation over to Ann Conley and to the outstanding panelists that we have. Ann Moore is known to many of us in the service movement. She is the president of Voices for National Service, which is a coalition of organizations committed to expanding opportunities of Americans of all ages to serve and to volunteer. She is also the Chief Strategy Officer and Executive Vice President of City Year, which is an AmeriCorps program dedicated to helping urban schools and students succeed. And City Year got its start right here in Boston, and it helped really inspire President Clinton in his work for the creation of AmeriCorps. One of our fellow commissioners, Alan Casey, was the co-founder of City Year. But Ann Moore has been really a leading voice for the idea of a year of service, that it should be this common expectation that I spoke of, and an experience of every American. And I thank her for her leadership in Washington and beyond. And she has built her career around growing a citizen service as a strategy and an opportunity for the next generation of Americans. She played a key role in the passage of the Edward M. Kennedy Serve America Act in 2009, and has been very active in today's efforts to expand how national service can address COVID-19 pandemic. She will formally introduce our panelists, but I am just thrilled that my fellow commissioner, Avril Haines, joins this panel discussion. She has been a particularly thoughtful member of the commission, blending her own commitment to service with her extraordinary public service in the Obama administration. And I'm thrilled that my fellow Massachusetts resident, John Santiago, is here, because he, like Alan, embodies the arc of service with his most recent elected office service, with his commitment to global service through the Peace Corps, and his professional achievements. And Adam Strong from the National Council of Young Americans as well. We thank you so much for your leadership. So we have an extraordinary moderator and three great panelists. And I'm thrilled to turn it over with my thanks to Alan to Ann Moore for today's panel. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Mark. And first of all, for the kind introduction, but also for the work that you and Avril and the rest of the National Commission has done over the last 2.5 years. The national service community in particular is grateful for all of the time that you all spent listening to us share our experiences. And it's just been, a really gratifying opportunity for us to think together about how to expand opportunities for Americans to serve. I also want to say welcome to everybody who joined us on Zoom today. I know we're all spending a lot of time on Zoom these days, getting our backgrounds just right. And I'm really just thrilled and honored to be part of this conversation. President Kennedy and Senator Kennedy were extraordinary champions of service, and their words and deeds were really sort of the foundation of building the modern national service movement that I've had the honor of working in for the last 25 years. It's a very personal topic to me. I spent a year as a Jesuit volunteer when I graduated from college. I went to Holy Cross in Worcester. And I have had lots of opportunities to work with the Kennedy and Shriver families over the years to advance service, as well as equity issues. And so it's really just an honor to be part of this conversation. As Mark mentioned, I had the opportunity to work very closely with Senator Kennedy to draft the Edward M. Kennedy Serve America Act and to work very hard for its passage. And I continue to believe that the vision in that act is the vision we should be aspiring to as a national service community. And we continue to really push forward, and we have some exciting news on that front today. But before I get to that, I just want to sort of go back a bit. Nearly 60 years ago, President Kennedy made a call to service that inspired many Americans on their own service journey, including a number of folks on this Zoom webinar today. And while great progress has been made to expand service opportunities and to meet the needs of our nation and our world, the potential for dramatically expanding national service opportunity really remains not yet quite realized. JFK's clarion call is as urgent and as important today, especially today in the context of everything we're facing as a country and as a world, as it was 60 years ago. And the challenges we face are new, and they're very complex and interrelated. Obviously, including the devastating impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, the racial issues and inequality and inequity that is gripping our nation and that we're all coming to terms with now, and growing divisions in our country that absolutely need to be healed. So as Mark mentioned, Americans engaged in military, national, and public service have made a heroic effort in the face of COVID-19. Service has brought aid and comfort to many people who have been affected by COVID-19, by the pandemic, but we have a long way to go to really beat this virus and to address its devastating impacts. The triple whammy of negative health, economic, and education impacts that are going to take sustained efforts to address. And as we think about what the new normal looks like, we know service has to be a central part of that. How do we answer JFK's call to service today? That's what we want to talk about. How do we go from vision to action, from poetry to prose, as my mentor Eli Siegel, who was the first CEO of the Corporation for National and Community Service, used to say? How do we build on the legacy of the more than 235,000 Peace Corps volunteers and the more than 1.1 million AmeriCorps members who've served their country in different ways? And how do we take the necessary steps to build a culture of service to meet our current and future challenges? That's really going to be the focus of our conversation today. So to help us all break it down, we have an incredible group. Let me introduce our panelists. Mark did a bit at the beginning, but I want to say a little bit more. First, Adam is a founding member of the National Council of Young Leaders and Opportunity Youth United, an organization that I've had the honor of serving alongside in different ways. He advises policymakers on the needs, barriers, and potential of opportunity youth with an eye toward equity and inclusion of those in rural communities. He's currently a Research Impact Fellow at the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, called CIRCLE, where he focuses on strategies that promote more equitable civic education and engagement. He's an AmeriCorps alum, thank you for your service, who served 2 terms with Youth Build USA, an organization I work very closely with, and is joining us today from Washington, D.C. Avril Haines serves as a commissioner of the National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service. She currently serves as the Deputy Director of Columbia World Projects at Columbia University and as a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. In the last administration, Avril served as an assistant to the president and principal deputy national security advisor. She also served as the deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And I've had the chance to spend some time with Avril and have just been incredibly impressed by how she dove right into this complex world of ours in national service and all of the great strategy and wisdom she's brought to this endeavor. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Representative, so many titles, John Santiago serves as a state representative for the 9th Suffolk District in Massachusetts. He has spent his entire life in service to others. As a volunteer community health specialist in the Peace Corps, thank you for your service. As a captain in the U.S. Army Reserve, and importantly, as an emergency room doctor at Boston Medical Center, he has been on the front lines of responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Each of these panelists has an extensive background in service, and I am already inspired by them, and there's still so much to learn. So let's jump in. To start us off, here's a question I'm sure everyone is asking on the other side of their screens. What inspired each of you to serve, and why do you continue to do so? So I'm going to ask each of you. I'm going to start with Adam and then move to Avril and then to John. Adam, take it away.
Thank you so much, Ann. My name's Adam Strong, and I just want to appreciate everyone for this opportunity. And really what inspired me to serve is actually quite interesting. So starting off right after high school, my first job right after high school was a security guard on a local coal mine. And obviously with the decline of the coal industry, I soon found myself out of work, and I soon found myself without many opportunities. I'm from a poor family. I needed to work, I needed income, and there wasn't a whole lot of opportunities in my small hometown. Had a lot of issues even, getting, an entry-level job. But my local community was lucky enough to have a local program called Youth Build. Youth Build is a nonprofit that works with young people to help them get their GED, as well as get training and certification for employment opportunities, particularly in carpentry and things of that nature. But through that program, I was able to learn a lot. So my first experience with service was really, I needed an income and things of that nature. But things really started to turn when after graduating from my local youth field program, I went on to serve 2 full-time AmeriCorps terms as a teacher's aide in my local program, helping others get their high school, their GED. And, I was lucky enough, I was doing this also while I was going to my local community college. And I ended up getting an opportunity to become a member of the National Council of Young Leaders. And it's a group of young people from across the country. And we would go on to start Opportunity Youth United, which is a national movement of young leaders, current and former Opportunity youth from across the country, all working to address local issues in their community. But one of the interesting things, being a member of the National Council of Young Leaders, is they really asked us, what's working in your community? What are some of the challenges? What's worked for you? What do you think? What are your ideas about how you would improve America? How would you increase opportunities here in America? And we'd go on to produce our recommendations to increase opportunity and decrease poverty in America. I highly recommend folks to look at those. But that's really when the light turned on for me, when I really started to think about, that I had the power, and that maybe, I had some knowledge and some experiences that could help shape policy and positive practices in my community to improve opportunity. So with that, I end up, I felt blessed and honored with the opportunities that I had. I used my Siegel AmeriCorps Award to transfer to the University of Kentucky's Medical Laboratory Science program. I worked in hospitals for a number of years. I was officially in the middle class. I was doing well, but my community, still wasn't doing that well. There was a lot of people that didn't have the same opportunities that I had. I was fortunate enough. So I decided to, change fields, change direction. So I went back to school for my master's in public policy, packed up everything I owned, went to New Hampshire. I really liked the Carson School of Public Policy, and then I even transitioned here to DC to work before I even had a job lined up. So that tells you a little bit about just me in general. But that's really what inspired me to serve. In the beginning was actually just income because I needed it. But what keeps me going every day is, just the potential solutions that are just around the corner and just working towards improving opportunities for people back home in my community.
Thank you. Thanks, Adam. Avriel, how about you? What inspired you to get involved?
Yeah, first of all, Amora, thank you so much. I can't tell you, I was talking about this earlier today, but just how grateful, certainly I was. Marc already knew a lot about national service in advance of serving on the commission, but to people like you who gave us, such generosity of time and thinking on the issues that we were working on. And I frankly only hope we did justice to, your wisdom and work on this, because you've spent so many years. But also, I mean, to people like Adam who are so inspiring, I have to say, in terms of what brought you to service. For me, it was my parents, first of all. I think my father was a teacher, my mother an artist, but very much engaged in service in their community, and I think that led me to respect it, to see the value of it in initial points. But once you start serving, I think what you find is that you get addicted to it in an odd way. It is so inspiring, to be able to actually bring value to a situation and create change is an extraordinary feeling. And I think certainly for me, over the course of my life, I've seen moments where I've been frustrated with our society, and I've thought we need to do something about it. And really, service is a way to do that. And it is quite empowering when you actually start to do it. And as Adam said, when people start asking for your views and you start trying to exercise them. But then as I ended up serving in government, in foreign policy, national security, and legal jobs, and so on, what I found was all of that was true, although it gets harder and harder to see the impact that you're having directly on the lives of other people, which is so addictive, as you start. It's still the camaraderie and the sense that all of you together can do something bigger than any of you could do apart is really, again, quite inspiring and addictive. And I found I've been so privileged to have opportunities to serve as sort of the way I felt about it. But I really, through this commission, I hope that we're able to give people a sense of what is out there and how much reward there is from doing this, but also to build the infrastructure to actually provide access to it in ways that really do not exist today, and that really satisfy the vision of much of the work that you've done, Amora, and things like the Serve America Act and so on. So, that's a piece of it. And to, I hope, over time, make our democracy healthier and unite some of our divisions and grow as a society in the way that we all imagine we can. So.
Thank you, Avriel. I agree completely. It is for sure addictive. John, how about you? Over to you for your experience, which has been in so many of the different realms we've talked about today.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. The MK Institute, the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library, and for my fellow co-panelists, Adam and April. It's good to be with you all. And Marc, it's been a while since we had breakfast, maybe about a year ago. But it's good to see you, at least virtually. And I apologize for the back and forth. We're actually in the midst of voting for a bill right now. And so I've been kind of hopping in and out. And, I've been part of the committee that's created this remote voting opportunity. So I'm actually in the building right now, but I'm on my phone voting yes or no on an important vote by mail bill, which I've been actively involved with. But I'm happy to be here with you all today to really talk about service. And it's so good to be with people who feel as passionately about this. So why I got into service, I think it really, for me, stems from my background. I'm a Puerto Rican kid, was born on the island, but grew up in the States. And I think when I my first memories were of Boston and growing up in a, for the most part, a segregated city and a community that was Black and brown, and watching my uncle who became infected with HIV/AIDS. And this was in the 80s and early 90s. And, what I recall is that, he died ultimately several years later, but because he was poor, because he lacked access to care, he died. and his son, my cousin, became an AIDS orphan. And this really impacted me. We were close, but it also just taught me at an early age about the inequity and how unfair the world could be. And I thought if I could do something about that, then I would. And ever since then, that really lit a fire in me. Simultaneously, there were these religious tones also, weaving into that. I don't go to church every Sunday. I don't belong to a certain denomination, but I think the moral of the story, or the parable where, Jesus would take off his shirt to give it to someone, where he would, serve the most vulnerable. That really something that inspired me at an early age. And so that kind of, those two experiences really led the way for me to get involved in healthcare and public health and medicine. And, medicine is a long track. There's medical school, college, residency. But I knew before I went into medical school and started that whole route, I wanted to spend some years in service. And I'd heard about the Peace Corps. And I said, that sounds like a pretty amazing experience. And I went ahead and did that. And at this time, I was really coming of age. I was reading all these books about these inspirational revolutionary leaders, some of which were political. And I thought, I had a role in this, and this is my generation's time. And so I joined the Peace Corps, and I was a bit naive. I thought we'd go there and we'd solve some problems. But I was really just dumbfounded in how naive I was and how complicated the situation was, and how, you were really up against 400 years of systemic racism and slavery and injustice. But at the same time, I was inspired by the work we can do and the relationships we can form and made, and we were able to do some good stuff. But as April said, I got addicted, and I thought that, we could do more. And I thought because I was educated, because I had certain opportunities, I had so much more to give back. And that's brought me back to medicine, because at the end of the day, I loved being in these conference rooms talking about these complicated problems and what are we going to do and how are we going to intervene. But I wanted to touch someone. I wanted to feel someone. I wanted to have the day-to-day, back and forth. And that's why I became a doctor. And so I became a doctor, I want to say 5 years ago. I work at Boston Medical Center. It is a safety net hospital in Boston, so it seats primarily poor Black and brown communities. And it's the experience, of a lifetime. And I work in the ER. And what I've learned in the emergency room is that, when people come in there, whether it's a gunshot, stroke, heart attack, they're in there, for the acute, issue, of course, but that's really a manifestation of what's going on in their respective communities. Whether it's poverty, violence, trauma, that ultimately will manifest in some sort of medical emergency. And so, when I treat people in the emergency room, it provides lens into the community. And I got to thinking, I could do so much more. There's so many issues downstream and upstream, and so many issues had to be dealt with politically. And that's why I decided to run for office. And, we've been in office for 2 years now, and it's been an incredible experience. And to give back, particularly in this COVID-19 era. I've worked every weekend over the past 20 weekends. So clinically, so I'm in there treating patients and having all the difficulties that we've heard about on the news, PPE, this insidious disease. And at the same time, during the week, attending to constituency services, small businesses. Like today, we're taking a vote to vote by mail, which is, given the situation. I was pretty active on this bill. Hopefully we'll pass it today. So it's been the honor of a lifetime. And I feel like, if we have the energy and the passion and the desire to serve, well, then it's expected of us. And given what we've had going on nowadays, I think it makes it much more clear.
Thanks, John, and for all that you're doing on really every level of helping communities to cope with the pandemic, but also to elevate our sites. I want to turn to Avril and come back to the work of the commission a bit. Avril, both President and Senator Kennedy believe that it was important not only to elevate service, but also to invest in it, to use the bully pulpit to ask Americans to serve, and then to make sure the resources were there to enable them to serve. Subsequent administrations have promoted service as an effective way of helping to meet specific challenges. The Commission's report is full of recommendations for how to strengthen and expand and elevate service. And I wondered if you could just share a few of the top recommendations with folks today.
Yeah, sure. I think in a way, we looked at this across the life cycle in a strange way. And I think it's sort of a way to think about and organize our recommendations and the way we thought about it. We we recommended, for example, significant support for civics education and service learning. And our goal, as stated, was exposure by 2031, essentially, of all kids from kindergarten all the way through high school, essentially, to having exposure to civics education and service learning. And that was a sort of an interesting piece of it. I'll try to do this too quickly because to get to everything, I shouldn't spend so long, but I found civics education to be a fascinating experience learning on the commission because it's not in our mandate, it's not in the statute, it's not part of what we were assigned to look at. And yet almost every conversation we ended up having across the country kind of came back to this question of how we have not invested in civics education. In fact, we've withdrawn our investment in civics education from the federal level over the last many years. And what data shows and research shows is that if you have a high quality civics education, you're more likely to engage in service. And so if you're going to inculcate a culture of service, the way Marc identified it and how we've been trying to think about it, you really need to invest in civics education, and you need to help people see how through their engagement in their community and their society, they can make the change that all of us have talked about that's so critical to service. And service learning is another sort of element on that path in a way, showing how you can do essentially service through all different types of disciplines. You can have a class on science and the environment and you can be engaging in service, or you can go through, you know, a whole series of different spaces. So it's the only recommendation where we actually assigned an amount of money. We said, here's a fund, you know, for 200 million for civics education, for 250 for service learning, and this needs to promote it across the range of education. So as a start. And then we talked about creating a service platform that really is intended to be a one-stop shopping, essentially, for folks to find out about service opportunities and then engage and have access to them across the range of service. And I think that was really a critical element of our work in the commission, was that we were assigned to look at, you know, national service, public service, military service, all of these different types of service. In order to promote this culture of service, we really need people to be able to see there are so many different opportunities. And if one doesn't work for you, there may be another that is going to be a better option in a sense, and leverage, you know, what talent and opportunity and interest you have in that context. That was a piece of it. In the national service space, you know, as been mentioned, what we saw is a vision, but by 2031, of essentially providing the support for 1 million people in national service. And, you know, and I know you know this well, but the Service America Act, I mean, here's an act that was passed, as you said, in 2009 on a bipartisan basis. And I think it's something that you see bipartisan support for in general. However, it has a vision of 250,000, but only, you know, but less than 75,000 are actually appropriated for. And you see the challenge in actually meeting the resources, to your point, for actually producing the landscape that allows people to serve. And we met folks in national service who have dedicated, you know, year of their life, for example, as a young person, to doing this kind of service. And they were on food stamps because, frankly, the living allowance didn't allow them the ability to do anything else. And, you know, so it shouldn't just be available for folks who have wealthy parents and can support them and through this process. So you need to make it available. You talked about the Siegel Award, and we talk about, you know, increasing the benefits, essentially the value of the Education Award, the flexibility of it, not getting taxed for it, whole series of things that we think would strengthen the opportunities for service in this space. We also looked at public service. We have recommendations, key recommendations that really go to some of the issues that have been raised, which is we need to actually shift to a talent management system. If you've ever been to USA Jobs, you know how challenging and frustrating it can be to get a job in public service. And yet there are extraordinary opportunities in public service that I want the best, you know, of our country to be serving in. We need to get rid of some of the archaic and rigid rules that we have that make it really challenging for us to attract the next generation. I think it's now 6% of the federal workforce is under the age of 30. We need a new generation coming into our federal workforce. And that means thinking about it differently. These folks are not thinking about their whole career in one job. They are looking to change jobs over time. We've seen that more and more. So having flexible benefits, things like that, that can move with you, whole series of things that we need to restructure in order to bring in that talent and to reward it over time and retain it. So it's a, you know, series of things in that space. And then also obviously in the military space. And then I'm just going to finalize with the following thing. One thing that we see across the board is the need to elevate, to prioritize service in the context of all of these mechanisms that we, have discussed, and that the devil is really in the details, and that by actually building a culture of service, we're going to need to bring these different types of service together and see if we can leverage the value in each to the advantage of the others. And we think that one of the only ways to really do that is to have a council in the White House, essentially, that focuses on service across the board, is then able to really elevate it, demonstrate priority for it, push that issue when it needs to be pushed, and coordinate across the different agencies that are involved in the service piece. So I think that's another big recommendation thing. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Avril. Yeah, and I would just underscore, the genius of this commission is that it's really looking at the entire ecosystem of service, not just one particular piece of it, and figuring out how each can help to reinforce or create connectivity with the others. I want to transition for a second to a conversation about the role of young people. Adam. So as many people watching this know, after a day of campaigning for president, Senator John F. Kennedy arrived at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor on October 14th, 1960 at 2 o'clock in the morning, hoping to get a little bit of sleep. The press corps had gone home, but 10,000 students were waiting to hear the presidential candidates speak. And it was there on the steps of the Michigan Union that the idea for the Peace Corps was launched. President Kennedy tapped into a generation and a generational moment. They were ready and eager to serve. Do you think young people today are ready? And how do they feel about service? How do they approach service? Adam, your thoughts on that?
Thanks so much for that question. The short answer is yes, young people are ready to serve. But kind of building on that, I just want to really appreciate some of your comments, Avril, about service learning and creating opportunities for exposure about service and the many different forms that service can look like. Telling a little bit about my story earlier, I wasn't really exposed to, what service even meant, what it could look like. But some of my experiences through Opportunity Youth United, again, we're a movement across the country. We have 19 youth-led community action teams across the country. And there's a real hunger for change. I mean, there's young people across the country that, they are volunteering. They are facilitating conversations with stakeholders in their community to really drive and help address different change or different issues and things of that nature. And there are some huge lofty goals out there. I mean, we have some groups that are trying to tackle homelessness in their community. I mean, they are ambitious, but they are really, bringing in the different stakeholders in their community and really trying to get to the heart of some of those different issues. But the thing is, it's really, exposure and those opportunities of service and really what it could look like. I think the passion for change is huge. I think being a part of something that's bigger than yourself and helping people, I think those are things that young people are really looking for right now, really looking, those opportunities. But I think there's some work that can be done perhaps on our side in terms of making those opportunities transparent, accessible, and meaningful in all the ways they need to be, taking in consideration the spectrum and development to build that culture of service, right? And it's really starting young. But again, young people are ready to serve. They just need a little bit more support, a little bit more work on our side to help make those opportunities available for them.
Thanks, Adam. Avril, so listening to what Adam just had to say, how do we do that? How do we ensure that young people that want to answer the call to service or their own call to service, how do they have access to opportunities? How do we help to connect those dots, as Adam said?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think his comments are spot on. I think of it in a couple of different ways. I mean, one is the awareness piece, as was mentioned, and really having an opportunity to get into schools and, essentially, ensure that people know about the opportunities is a part of the problem, but there's two parts to it. One is actually resourcing, getting into the schools and making sure that people are capable of doing that, having a thing like the service platform and so on. But another part of it is promoting diversity in service, right? So frequently what happens is you find military goes to the same schools that they've been going to for a long time to do their recruitment. You know, folks who live in other areas that don't see them very often don't even think about military as a service. Similarly, you know, there are places that the military goes that we would find that they say, yeah, we've never seen anybody from the State Department or from the federal government come to our school to talk about those opportunities. So there's I think, you know, when we try to reflect this in our report a little bit, but to really, to drill down into creating that diversity of service in the different service areas and the importance of doing that. And that's a part of the broader concept of creating a culture of service and actually uniting us in a more coherent way across these areas. So that's one piece of it. Then there's the access piece, which is, you know, to say that it is, you know, we talked about, for example, mandatory service and whether or not it made sense to require, you know, folks when they reach the age of 18, you know, and or within a certain range or so on to have a year of service. And there were a lot of reactions. I mean, sort of interesting folks who believed in mandatory service and unexpected ways, and others who didn't, and who had, you know, who believed in a universal expectation of service, which is ultimately what we recommend, but really thought, like, I don't think the government should be telling me what to do and so on. But another piece of it is the idea that, you know, depending on the socioeconomic space that you happen to live in this country, you may not be able to take a year to do service, right? Unless you have to, you know, earn money for your home. You have to do things like Adam talked about, right? So we actually have to create an infrastructure. If we really want a universal, you know, expectation of service, we need to create the infrastructure and help to provide the benefits that are absolutely appropriate for people who are going to engage in service. And so I see that as a critical element of actually allowing for the kind of broad service that we're talking about, which comes back again to things like the Serve America Act and seeing it get resourced the way it needs to, and in fact expanding it and, you know, doing the work on the education benefits and the living allowances and so on, but also in a whole range of different areas across the board.
If I could just add to that, I think, you know, the outcomes that will result as a, you know, if you begin to democratize service. I mean, I think when I did the Peace Corps, I mean, I was maybe one or two people of color in my group, and we all went to, you know, Latin America, which is great. I mean, it exposes them to a different culture, teaches them Spanish. They take these skills back to their respective communities. But I think about so many people in my community that were unaware of these service opportunities. You know, I think I remember the day I found out about the Peace Corps. I was getting my medical school application ready, and I happened to be in a computer lab, and there was a Peace Corps flyer outside my, like, you know, dorm. And I was like, oh, what is that? And I looked it up. And as a result, I joined the Peace Corps, like, you know, several months later. And if it wasn't for that flyer at that public university, I would not have known. I would have been in med school. And I guarantee you, I would not be an emergency room doctor taking care of vulnerable patients, really concerned about the social, political issues of the day. You know, I always joke around with my, like, friends that I'd be some orthopedic surgeon living in some big house with 2.5 kids who could give a damn about the world. But, you know, no disrespect to my orthopedic friends, but I've changed as a result of my service. When I look at the desire to serve, as Adam was illustrating, I mean, so many people want to go up there, and with so many issues going on today, particularly, you know, just look at the news. There's a desire there, but we have to give these opportunities. And at the end, the more people we have participating in service, more people of color out there who take a year off or 2 years off to grow, mature, gain some sort of professional experience. When they re-enter the workforce, they're going to be able to add so much more. And I think that's what, you know, I'm hopeful about.
Yes, thanks. I couldn't agree more. It is a transformational opportunity for people and for the country. I want to transition. I know that that John's got to leave us in a little bit to continue his important work there on the bill that he's been championing. I want to talk a little bit about COVID-19, especially given your role as an ER doc. As we look at COVID-19, public servants, medical professionals, military national service members, and of course, citizen volunteers are really working tirelessly to help address the issues that have been either raised or exacerbated by the virus. They've been working to safeguard public health, get food to people who need it, and address so many of the social and economic impacts. And as somebody who's been on the front lines, as you have, as an emergency room doctor, what are some of your takeaways about how the public servant world has responded to the pandemic? And do you think that there now might be a greater appreciation for the role that service can play in helping us to meet our challenges? And if so, how do we build on that momentum? How do we sort of take this moment and use it to help pivot this agenda?
Well, I think as you eloquently stated, I think COVID-19 has exposed and exacerbated so much of the inequity that exists in our world. And for some of us who were involved in that in some way or another, whether it was treating patients or working in policy, it's not necessarily a surprise, but now people are becoming much more aware. And I think about the role that service people have. I thought actually about introducing a bill, when we were considering a lack of healthcare workforce, or the fact that the healthcare workforce would get sick. What are we going to do with all these medical students and all these PA students, or all these residents that weren't necessarily working? Could we include them in some sort of program, whether it be contact tracing, which was in desperate need, or some other form of fashion? I think what COVID-19 has showed us is that how fragile so much of the American economy is, our society is. And I think about what's going on. I mean, it's not just a public health crisis. It has morphed into the greatest economic recession since the Great Depression. And on top of that, what we've seen this past week, I mean, it's important to know why people are out in the streets protesting. They're not protesting just because an innocent Black man by the name of George Floyd was killed by a cop. They're protesting because of the desperation they see. And when they feel that they're just as likely to die from coronavirus than they are from the hands of police brutality, it says something. It should say something to all of us, as servant leaders, as political leaders, as medical leaders, that there's a deep desire to do something about this. And that's where, when I see a protest, and Boston's had a number of them, throughout this past week, I see the desire and the energy and the goodwill that Adam was talking about to get things done. And that's what gives me hope. And I think the service industry and people that care about giving back had a tremendous role to play with this, because we're going to need all hands on deck to address this. This is not just a medical issue, an economic issue. This is really about the soul of our country. And I think why I cling to service-oriented people is because they know that this is much more about themselves. I think if we had more of that in us as a country, we'd be in a better place than we are right now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we've been watching AmeriCorps programs around the country respond in really innovative and very nimble ways to the challenges. And what's interesting is I think folks are seeing that the issues that are becoming exposed through this have been there and have been there for a long time. And so this is sort of an opportunity to kind of shine a spotlight. There is a little bit of good news I'll just share, and it's hot off the presses, and then we'll get back to our conversation, which is that Senator Coons and Senator Wicker, along with a bipartisan group of colleagues, actually are in the process of introducing a piece of legislation that would scale up the existing national service infrastructure, AmeriCorps and Senior Corps, to help meet the needs of communities struggling with the pandemic. And among many other things that the legislation would do, in addition to increasing opportunity, to also really increase the value proposition so that more young people of different backgrounds can serve, including increasing the stipend and doubling the education award and some other really kind of game-changing ideas. So they are committed to doing it in a bipartisan way and seeking to get it into the next Senate COVID package, and more to come on that. But it's really exciting to see members of both parties coming together to say, this is a workforce that can really be game-changing, because they are on the ground, they know communities, they're connected to communities, and they have the cultural sensitivity and skills to bring to the game. So we're really excited about that movement. Aside from that, Avril, what else could we be doing from a policy perspective on leveraging the pandemic to help us really galvanize Americans to really think about all these issues that are being exposed through this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in the past, we've used national service to try to address some of the fundamental needs that occur as a consequence of crises like this. And it's, just to sort of reiterate in some respects what's already been said and what Representative Santiago was talking about, I think we saw that in the context of the 2008 crisis as well, where we really recognized through the Recovery Act the opportunity to bring national service into the picture in order to actually start to deal with some of the needs, including some of the socioeconomic needs that were a part of that crisis. And And it just, I think it was only like 16,000 people in that circumstance. It was a really pretty small amount, but it gives you a sense of what's possible through service in these moments, in addition to, the sort of the right answers from a broader cultural perspective. There are actually hard things that people can be doing, helping with job placements and all kinds of things that can help to address some of the, frankly, exacerbated inequalities that exist as a consequence of the crisis. But as you point out, these are underlying problems, but they get worse through disaster recovery. But then there's also, I think it's worth highlighting in the context of public service. I mean, for me, I think one of the challenges has been in public service. It's not just about the fact that there are archaic rules and we need to attract a new generation and so on, and the system itself needs to be updated and reformed in effect. But it's also the morale issue and the sort of the way the country perceives public service. And it's become more and more challenging, I think, for us to break through to recognize the value of public servants in these moments. I mean, when you think about healthcare workers or transportation workers, or, the folks who are writing the checks for stimulus, or, in the Treasury Department, other places, like across our society, these folks are really holding things together right now. And yet, because the morale is so bad and the institutions are not as well respected as they need to be, and the sort of there's a defeatism associated with that really is, I think, a great challenge for the country. And it's one that I think, to your point, through policy, we need to actually reform that. And we recognized, in this challenge, we talk about how these members of society help us, the person who's, you think about your weather report that comes from, frankly, the government and civil servants and so on, trying to lift up the role of public servants, trying to help people understand the value of it. And then ultimately through reforming the personnel system and working through to a talent management system, that over time, hopefully you see a move. But to give you a sense of the how big that challenge can be in moments like this, we've got, for example, in the Department of Veterans Affairs, I think it's something close to 49,000 vacant positions. Like, it tells you just how extraordinary the problem is if we don't recruit people, and Veteran Affairs is going to be important in a moment like, COVID-19, right? There are so many spaces that we're losing, in effect, the muscle that we need in these places that provides the resilience in these types of crises that may not be there for us. And these are the kinds of reforms that need to get done, the sort of, hit your head against a wall and get to the details kind of things that really make a difference over the long term. So I think that's through policy and prioritization, getting to these types of issues so that you can actually create greater resilience in the community for these crises would be a critical aspect of it.
Couldn't agree more. My dad was a public servant for 39 years, and it is something to see that community, the way that they feel so down about their role and their work. John, while we have you for a few more minutes, I want to ask you a very specific question about Boston and Massachusetts. Boston and the entire state of Massachusetts is sort of known for having an incredibly strong culture of service, and some call Boston in particular the Silicon Valley of national service. Why do you think that is, and what else needs to be done to help sort of ignite that kind of energy all across the country?
That's a great question. I didn't know that, actually, that Boston was regarded in that, and it kind of makes sense, I guess, with city year. To me, I mean, I think, back to the civics education piece that April was speaking about. I mean, I love the history, and I love learning about the founding fathers, and I'm inspired by the work they did. And I mean, that's what played a role in me getting involved in public service and joining the Army, that sort of thing. How that's going to, ignite the rest of the country, I don't know. What I will say is that, living in today's age with the technology that we have, with all the issues and the interconnectivity of what we're seeing, is that, that there are many more Bostons out there, that there are many more programs, that there are many nonprofits doing similar work. You just have to find them. And I think at Boston, the emphasis we play on public education here, We have some of the best public education in the country, but we also have some of the biggest achievement gaps. And which really gets to the point that we were speaking about earlier. It's like, how are we democratizing public service and making sure that we're all using it? And so I think, we as public officials and elected leaders, it's good to hear that there's some movement on the national level, but how we can reinforce, strengthen, and provide resources. Because at the end of the day, a budget is just a value statement. And I think, pound for pound, my Peace Corps director, I don't know if Mark knows this guy, Romeo Massey, was a longtime Peace Corps director. And he always used to say, it's like pound for pound, this is the best investment that the U.S. government could do across the world. And I always thought about that. I think about AmeriCorps and City Year. And City Year is in the district I represent. It's just, down the street from where I live, actually, the big building on Columbus. And so I see the kids walking around and they're dressed. And I think there's so much more to do. And I think it's such a relatively great investment that we just need to, make sure that we're providing the resources necessary.
Couldn't agree more.
With that, I think I got to run and take this important vote here. So I want to thank you all for the opportunity to be a part of this panel. I'm sure I'll be seeing you in these service circles as we get over this COVID-19 pandemic, hopefully sooner than later.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for all of the many ways that you are serving your state and your community and all the people that really look to you to help them medically and otherwise. John, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to transition now. We have some questions that were submitted by folks who are joining us today on the Zoom, and I want to transition to try to get some audience submitted questions in here before we close. And the first one we've touched on, but I thought this one was particularly compelling. And the question is, how can national service help overcome the current challenges our country is facing, such as racial discrimination, civil unrest, and the COVID-19 pandemic and massive unemployment? We've talked a little bit about aspects of that, but Adam, I wonder your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. I think it's really important that we uplift and talk about that, especially given everything that's going on right now. I think that, part of that, in my opinion, is that, there's been so many unheard voices for so long. And when they do speak out, they are dismissed. I think national service, really provides an opportunity to kind of build leadership pipelines in communities to increase, some of those dialogues and even facilitate supporting, people in community, helping to address some of those issues and challenges locally. And I think that national service provides a great opportunity for that. And I think that could potentially provide other frameworks for other communities. I think that, there's some programs that, really work with the service model and really support mayors around the country. So I think that, the strong relationship you can have with young people, especially all young people, that includes, the Black community, Black young women and men, and it includes low-income neighborhoods, those that have been underrepresented, in other spaces. I think providing opportunities for there to be a real discussion where everyone is involved can hopefully, work towards more meaningful solutions. But it's going to take everyone, and I think national service provides a foundation that could allow everyone to be a part of that solution and conversation.
Thanks, Adam. Avril, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'd love to. I fully agree with Adam's points. I think I like the way the question is framed. How can we overcome these things? And I have to say, I don't think national service on its own or service across the board can overcome on its own the systemic racism that's at the bottom of what we've seen with, that's a part of the landscape that led to the heartbreaking death of George Floyd. And yet I think it's fundamental to us overcoming those challenges. And I think, as you rightly pointed out early, Amora, there's the systemic racism that Floyd's death shines a light on, in effect, a brighter one than has already been in some ways. but it's also overlaid with inequality, and the United States has the highest inequality, among advanced economies and in the world. And we really have enormous challenges in these moments. And when I think about what can we do in a moment like this, there's effectively, this produces a call to stand up and to exercise empathy and solidarity with those members of our society who are subject to this on a daily basis, and to demand action and change, and to try to address some of the inequities that are at the root of it. And in many ways, I think societies are more capable of doing that when they're able to work together to have empathy across communities, as Adam was saying, and through service, you actually can build those bridges in a way that I've not seen any other structure within society do as effectively. Because if you serve in a community that's not your community and you begin to understand the challenges that they're facing, it's an opportunity for you to step out of your space and learn those. It's an opportunity, if there's a universal expectation of service, to have that sort of coherent sense of our country, of where each of us have this common experience of where we served, and what that was like and how it felt. And moreover, I think, going back to my first comments, there's a sense of empowerment that you have through service that makes you feel like you can change the society. This is not something that has to be this way. And that's something that I think is critical in these moments, is to remind ourselves of this. But I live in New York, and it has been gratifying to see among the protests, I think, a wide cross-section of society standing up and saying this is unacceptable and this is something that needs to change. So
couldn't agree more with both of you. I want to switch gears a little bit to talk about the military. We haven't spent much time talking about the military today, but we have a good question here from one of our audience members that asks, what role does the military play in U.S. society beyond serving as an armed force? For example, scientific research, the Army Corps of Engineers, disaster relief, etc. I wonder if you have a thought or two on that.
Yeah, I've had the great joy of seeing sort of how much more the military is across society. And, even in things like from a foreign policy standpoint that you don't expect them to be critical, but actions in relation to Ebola, for example, around the world, dealing with pandemics, there are Guard units that are deployed and working on COVID-19 issues. In fact, our chairman is in one of he happens to be a physician, and he's running a group that, is dealing with COVID-19. Sounds like Representative Santiago has a similar experience, and you see how the military gets deployed across so many different mission sets, disaster relief, a whole series of things in society. And what's interesting about it, from my perspective in the context of our work on the commission, is that it by pulling together service across all these different areas, and recognizing how each of them can interact with each other, you start to see the opportunities to help, right? So, when it comes to COVID-19, as you point out, it's people think, okay, maybe public servants, healthcare workers, and so on, but they don't recognize just how many parts of public service are actually contributing to, an issue like this. But again, they also don't think of the military as being so fundamental to our response. And yet that's absolutely a part of the picture. And that also shows you how people who are interested in one type of service can cross over to the other type of service and actually enjoy it, much like Alan has, or other folks in our communities. It's really extraordinary to see that. So it's, yes, I see that. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I find when I get into conversation with folks that have served in youth build like Adam, or through the U.S. military, or folks that have served in the Peace Corps, there's almost like a common language and ethos. And if we can find a way to create that connective tissue, as I've said to Marc too many times over the years, I think it's going to benefit all of us. I want to go to the next audience question. And Adam, this one I'm going to go to you for. What are your suggestions for individuals who want to engage with national and public service, but they don't know where to start?
Thanks so much for that question. I think there's a couple different approaches for how to engage and really find those opportunities, because something that was spoken and mentioned several times throughout this is that sometimes they're not always as accessible or transparent, some of these different opportunities. I think that, you know, if you're interested, I would highly recommend, obviously, you know, going online and researching some of these different opportunities, going to these different websites. But my almost number one recommendation, though, is really to find, you know, some adult allies, maybe a colleague, maybe, you know, if you're a young student, a teacher, or what have you, and to really just be open a little bit, perhaps even a little vulnerable. Let them know what you're interested in, what you're passionate about, you know, or even asking about different opportunities and different things like that. I could tell you how many different opportunities that I've been fortunate enough to find out about, and it was really through relationships and really having a conversation and being open with someone about, you know, if, you know, and just asking if they know about any of these different opportunities. So that's where I would recommend. And obviously, I know I would. You know, I'm kind of biased, but I think Youth Build is an absolutely great program if that's a fit for you. AmeriCorps, absolutely wonderful if you want to do something in your community. And obviously, you know, the military, I think, is a great option, you know, if you want to serve your country. And there's a lot of different benefits that goes along with that as well.
Great. And I'm going to ask you a follow-up, which comes from the next question, which is how can we as a country promote national service as a good alternative to pursue after high school or college or during retirement? Like, what's the best way to reach people?
I think everyone is just so different. I think we have to use a multidisciplinary approach, especially as it relates to communication. I mean, there is no magic bullet in terms of that, but I really do think that what we could do, though, I guess some of the different things to strengthen. I know the commission has made one of the recommendations the commission has made is for a cash option for the AmeriCorps Siegel Education Award, and I think that is a wonderful thing. I know back home, pretty much all my friends, I'm the only one with a post-secondary degree, a college degree, and they're all highly successful in different jobs and doing great things. And I think that you know, that being available to them, right, in terms of, you know, if they served as an AmeriCorps member and they're able to actually get that money and perhaps use that for a vehicle, right? That could be seed money for a vehicle. And that's like one of the most influential things to really open up opportunities if you're a young person in a rural community where public transportation can be virtually non-existent. So I think that is a one way, but I think, you know, just a multidisciplinary approach in terms of communication, meeting people where they are. I think that's the absolute most important thing, and really taking a universal target approach, right? You know, universally we want to target everybody, but let's do some targeted approaches to different people from different backgrounds, different communities, make sure that we're inclusive and really representative of everybody.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And of course, channels matter, right? Depending on who you are and what you listen to. I want to sort of round us out here with a question for both of you, and maybe Avril, I'll start with you. The commission makes the case that really this is the time for us as a country to lean into, to strengthen and expand service in America. Can you tell us what, from your point of view, is the most important thing we can do in the next year in terms of taking action on what you all found and what you're recommending?
Yeah, pass legislation. So, I mean, honestly, like, put some money behind it and some resources and, you know, work it through. I mean, one thing that's really astonishing going around the country to me is the younger generation. I mean, you know, the sort of millennial through Z, whatever, really interested in service. I mean, I was fascinated by how much they expressed an interest. They came to some, you know, our public meetings. I mean, who really wants to go to a public meeting of a commission, you know, when you're a young person in these places? And they are astonishingly generous in heart and, you know, and sort of, and so inspiring in terms of their dedication to seeing how they can make society better, you know, sort of through their lens, whatever the issue is that they have focused on. And and we need to back it up, you know, as a country, we need to actually support them in doing that and engage them. And I think that is among the most important pieces. Yeah, so that would be my answer, but can I just add on one thing from the prior? To Anna's point, if you're wondering about where to go to service, I do hope we have a service platform at one point that is sort of like that one-stop shopping where you can go and you can find out about everything. But for now, you can go to www.nationalservice.gov, right? Like, and actually see a whole range. You can also go to usajobs.gov, which is available. So those are places to look for these things, and I would recommend that you do that. And if you are interested in public service, which I very much hope you will be, one of the recommendations we make is that we really enormously expand the use of internships and a whole series of things, and really just testing it out so that you can see what it's like. I was an intern. I loved it. It was, you know, it changed my course. So I think trying those things out is really worthwhile. Thank you.
Thanks, Avril. I couldn't agree more. Adam, over to you. Your thoughts on that question. What's the most important thing we can do? And by the way, I also want to ask you, because you talk to policymakers, what do you find the most compelling argument for national service when you're talking to folks on the Hill?
I guess I'll address the second part of that. So just in terms of conversation with legislators on Capitol Hill, I think an effective message is an authentic one. So I think really, you know, leveraging your story and your experiences with national service and really tying that into where you are now and what it allowed you to be able to do. I think that's one of the most, you know, powerful thing. Obviously, it's great to uplift, you know, statistics and how it's beneficial. And there's a lot of different groups out there that, you know, has that information. But I think really just authentically uplifting your story and why you care. And I think that can be one of the most powerful things in moving hearts and changing minds and, you know, expanding some of the votes on some of these different bills that we need. For the second part of your question, you know, really kind of ties into the legislative process and really thinking about, you know, going after those funds and the money to really you know, implement and support, you know, some of the commission's recommendations. I think that, you know, one of the lucky things that I'm a part of is the Reconnecting Youth campaign, which is a campaign calling on Congress to invest in opportunities for opportunity youth, educational opportunities, service opportunities, workforce and job training. And a lot of the different programs are under this umbrella is AmeriCorps, it's Youth Build, it's the National Guard Youth Challenge Program. So this is a cohort, this is a collaboration of organizations from across the country that is all advocating together and collectively, right? Building that political will so that we can get some positive legislation and movement so that we expand access to some of these programs that are much needed. So I am a huge fan of, you know, talking to local legislators. You know, I think that's one of the most effective ways to make your voices heard and to be a part of the legislative process. I think the more voices we have, the better policies ultimately that we will have. So if you do want to talk to your local legislative office, if you want to write an email, if you're like, how do I even get started? I don't even know who my representative is, right? Or I don't even know what the legislation is. I just know I support national service, right? I support these programs. Then what you can do is if you go to sparkaction.org/act, so sparkaction.org/act, ACT. Then what that'll do is I'll put you to this website link where it'll have a couple different legislative options that provide some different summaries. You type in your basic information and it walks you through a nice stepwise process so you can email your local representative and make your voices heard. So that's my best recommendation on that.
Thank you, Adam. And yeah, couldn't agree more. And if you're interested in learning more about the Coons-Wicker proposal, you can go to voicesforservice.org and plug in there as well. I wish I could get to all the rest of these questions. There are some really good ones that have come in, but we are close to being at time. And so I want to thank Avril and Adam and John, who unfortunately has had to leave us a little early, for all of your incredible work and leadership and perspectives and for being with us today. And I will turn it back over to Marc to help close us out.
Well, thank you very much, Inmore. What an inspiring conversation. And I especially thank my friend Avril and Adam. You certainly represented everything so well, your own journey. Thank you so much for speaking to it so thoughtfully. And of course, John Santiago, who is really the triple crown of service through military, national, and public service. He is just inspiring as well. So great questions and expertly moderated. So we are really thankful. This is a pivotal moment. I think Gabriel said it well with the urgency for the, as you said, Amor, for the Bundeswehr legislation, the moment where our country is deeply searching for ways to cross the divides that are so evident in society today. And so our hope, representing the Commission, is that these ideas, the kind of things that we have, will provide the opportunities and legislative opportunities to advance. It's a bold vision, but it's a necessary vision. It's one that's based on, in the case of the Peace Corps, 50 plus years of histories of AmeriCorps has proven itself domestically through AmeriCorps, through the corporation and organizations like City Year. And certainly our military and national service has been just an extraordinary part of the American fabric. So the time is now. We think we have a roadmap. We have organizations like Voices for National Service that advance and represent these ideas so well. So we thank you all for joining us. For those in the audience, we're thrilled with this. For more on the Commission's recommendation, our report, our legislative annex and supporting materials can be found on our website, www.inspire2serve.gov. So you can look at that and advance that. As I said, we believe these recommendations really that are advanced in our report will go a long way to the ideals that President Kennedy laid out almost 70 years ago, and Senator Kennedy so affirmed during the course of his legislative career. So now is the time, we believe, to be inspired to serve. We think this is the plan that can take it there. And so we thank you all for joining us. Please stay well and stay safe. And I end with, again, where I began, I guess, my gratitude to Alan Price from the library and to the EMK. Alan, we'll kick it back to you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Marc. Thank you to all the panelists and moderators. And I'd like to thank the audience for being part of this very important discussion. The Commission has done tremendous work. I encourage you to read the report and find some way to answer President Kennedy's call to service. And I would be remiss if I didn't plug the two easiest and yet simplest ways to answer the call to service. One is to make sure you're registered to vote, and two is make sure you fill out your census. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. Go forth and serve.